Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean McGrath. I'm the Céan Fine of the Clan McGrath of Ulster. And like many of you, we're deeply committed to exploring the history and heritage of Irish clans and historic families. I am particularly drawn to the architectural legacy of Gaelic Ireland, perhaps the most potent of which is, of course, the Irish Tower House. These unique and formidable structures lie across our landscape and are testament to the power of the clans who built and once occupied them. The fact that they can be identified and associated with particular families, the history of which are often recorded in the annals, gives many who visit a deep and often emotional connection with them. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to Finola Finlay, who will today provide us with a wonderful insight into the Irish Tower Houses. I've actually spoken to Finola on occasions in relation to the Tower House of the Clan McGrath in Ulster, and we've had a really great discussion about its architecture, particularly in the late Gaelic period. Finola trained as an historian and archaeologist in Ireland, but spent most of her life in cultural and heritage studies in West Cork. With her husband, Robert Harris, she blogs at rollingwaterjournal.com, and I would invite you all to take a look at that blog, where Finola invites us to explore the landscape, archaeology, history, music, language, architecture, food and culture of West Cork. Truly one of the most beautiful places on earth. Through her blog, Finola gives her readers a sense of what life is like in this wild and remote part of Ireland. So without further ado, please welcome Finola Finlay. Finola, over to you.
Can you hear me?
I hear you very well.
Yeah, okay. Dia Yves a Charja, tá anarthas áhasarm the anseo aniu agus the ag caint livse fhui Cashlan na Héireann no tuairthig mar a dtéir na Seandálaí. So thank you very much for this kind invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you today, talking to you about the castles of Ireland, or as the archaeologists call them, the Tower Houses. So as Sean alluded to, two things have led to a fascination for me with the castles of West Cork. First of all, my background in archaeology and history, but more than that, the fact that I live above and look down on a tower house, quite a ruinous tower house, the Castle of Rossbryn. And while, as I said, we normally just call them castles, and it's the archaeologist who coined this phrase, tower houses, but it's a helpful phrase because a tower house is a particular kind of castle, and it occurs all over Ireland. Now, most of my study has been done in West Cork, and therefore, you know, my examples are from West Cork, but they're all fairly typical of what you'll find all over Ireland. So even though your clan may not be from West Cork or anywhere close to it, this talk will help you look at these medieval structures more knowledgeably. In fact, that's actually my aim for this talk, that next time at a dinner party, you'll be able to dazzle your friends with specialized terminology like bartizan and crenellation. You'll be just tossing out these terms. But more importantly, as you walk around these sites, and of course, as you know, they're everywhere, you'll recognize the features they contain, and you'll understand how they were built, why they look like what they do, who built them, when, and for what purpose. Now, castles and tower houses date from the period after the Norman invasion. And as you all know, Normans from England and Wales came to Ireland in 1169 on the invitation of a warring Irish king. They were supposed to help him get sorted, but in fact, they stayed for 800 years. So let's start from the beginning and take a look at what were high status individuals, clan chieftains, for example, what were they living in before they started to build castles? Well, they were living in ring forts. There's a huge variety, as you know. Ring forts is a very simple, plain one, but it's beautifully situated on a hilltop, and many of them were with commanding views around the countryside. Sometimes they were more complex. This one has two huge fosses around it and a very elaborate entrance. They had houses inside that looked like this. They had wooden palisades around the tops of the banks, and sometimes there's evidence for quite elaborate entrances. We call them forts, of course. They were farmhouse enclosures in the very same way we build walls around our own houses now and have our own private gardens. But they probably had functions of keeping cattle in at night or other animals and keeping wolves out, besides any kind of raiders or enemies. Sometimes they were made of stone, and in that case, they're normally called cashels. Here's a beautiful example of a stone cashel, Knockdrum in County Cork. Once again, as you can see, panoramic views over the countryside. This one has the lower course of a stone house. Probably the rest of it was built of wood and thatch. And under that stone house is quite an elaborate souterrain or underground passage. The other thing, they probably lived in, high status individuals like this, was promontory forts. And here's a great example of a promontory fort. And you can see that the promontory is very easily defended. It's got tall cliffs on all sides, treacherous rocks, and then one tiny narrow rock, one tiny narrow neck to enter the promontory, very easily defended. Initially, this would have been defended by earthen or stone banks and ditches. In this case, a tower house has been built right at the entrance at a later date. Now, there may have been structures called castles before the arrival of the Anglo-Normans in 1169. The term Cashlawn and Cashdale show up in documents of the period in annals, and they may fit a definition of a castle as, if we define a castle as a fortified residence combining administrative and judicial functions, but in which military considerations were paramount. And that's a bit of an old-fashioned definition, because we tend to think of forts and castles as a military defensive features being paramount. But in fact, we mustn't forget that these were private dwellings, probably first and foremost. Before tower houses were built, or before castles were built, as I said, there's likely to have been things that were built in Ireland before the Anglo-Normans that were called castles, but we don't actually know what they look like. They may have been sort of beefed up cashels or fortified crannogs. They may have had wooden palisades, possibly a tower. The term super cashel has been coined to describe them. But whatever they were a development of previous indigenous structures rather than an outside innovation. And it was the Anglo-Normans that brought those outside innovations with them. Now, the castle as a common feature really did arrive with the Anglo-Normans. And what were they building? It took them about 50 years to get to West Cork. And there's no reason to doubt that they built fortified structures once they got here. But for reasons I'll explain in a moment, none of those have survived in my area of study, which stretches from the Beara Peninsula to Glandore, more or less. But if they had survived, what would they have looked like? Well, this is a distribution map of Motte and Bailey, the Motte and Baileys, just for the southern part of the country. This was a typical Norman structure. This illustration is by J.G. O'Donoghue, a brilliant young artist who's given me permission to use several of his illustrations. I'm very grateful to him. And essentially they were earth mounds with a bailey or enclosed area in front of them, often surrounded by a motte. And the structures inside and the palisades were all made of wood. Most of the structures have not survived, but the the mounds themselves and the moats around them have survived. This is one from St. Mullins in Carlow. And as you can see, the very substantial earthwork. So if they had existed in West Cork, there would still be signs of them there. So masonry castles, that's probably what they were building. We have no evidence that they were building Motte and Baileys in West Cork. They were probably building masonry castles. And as opposed to tower houses, and I'll come to tower houses in a minute. So the best example of what I'm talking about, or the masonry castle, is probably Trim Castle in County Meath. It's a large keep surrounded by a bawn wall, and this bawn wall is punctuated by towers. It's absolutely enormous. It was built by Hugh de Lacy. It took him 30 years. It was completed in about 1220. The nearest we have in West Cork to something like that, and there aren't a lot of these enormous things around Ireland, but there certainly are some. And the nearest thing we have in West Cork to that is Liscarroll Castle. Now, this is a type known as a keepless castle. There is no central keep. There are no stone buildings inside the bawn. As you can see, the bawn is huge, very substantial. It has these round towers on the corners, and it has this enormous gatehouse, which is where, and the towers in the gatehouse would have held some residential accommodation. But the inside of the bawn would have been probably filled with wooden buildings. This is what Liscarroll Castle looked like. There was a battle there in 1640. You can see that as well as the keep itself, or the keepless bawn itself, the bawn wall, there were substantial fortifications on the outside as well. It was built, it was one of the castles of the de Barrys. So if there's any Barry clan here, this is one of your castles. The next thing that I'd like to talk about is chamber towers. And this was another very typical tower, and there are several of these all around Ireland that were built by the Anglo-Normans. Probably what they were building in West Cork. Now, as an archaeologist years ago, I learned to call these hall houses, but this terminology is changing as more of them have been studied, and it's become apparent that they were not halls, but private residential towers. And here's an example. This is Athenry, I believe, where the chamber tower is in one corner of the bawn and the hall is in another corner. So these were two separate uses for these buildings. The chamber tower was residential, and the hall was for conducting public business. And this is the distribution of these chamber towers around West Cork. And once again, you can see there really aren't too many of them, but there is a reason for that. This is one, it's at Glanworth in North Cork. It's a complex site. The chamber tower came first, and that is the building on the left. It's sort of a squarish, squat building, probably two-story, with the tower that you see on the right was part of the later fortification. And here's another good example. You can see the similarities between them. This is Grennan in Kilkenny, and it was built around 1210. Now in West Cork, in West Cork, the Anglo-Normans arrived about 1220 or so, and the next 40 years appear to have been relatively peaceful, with intermarriage between the Normans and the Irish. The Normans sided with one or another of the Irish clans in their battles between each other, and generally now and later were able to exploit the lack of unity between the clans. And I'll talk in a bit about that lack of unity and where it came from. However, in 1261, under the leadership of Fineen McCarthy, the Irish united for once and defeated an Anglo-Norman and Irish force at the Battle of Callan near Kilgarvan in County Kerry. Fineen McCarthy then marched east to Kinsale, and it was a raised earth policy. He destroyed every castle he came to. And this explains why in West Cork we have no surviving examples of an Anglo-Norman castle. Now, I think, as I said, we would have had, we would still see evidence of motte baileys. There aren't any, but we would see evidence. We don't see any evidence of chamber towers or masonry castles, and we know we have documentary evidence of some that he did destroy. So in Ireland, what we're talking about now in my area is not Anglo-Norman castles, but we're talking about the Irish clans and their castles. And those are all tower houses. Now here's one map of the distribution of tower houses. The black dots are definite, the red dots are possible, and you can see exactly how numerous tower houses are. In fact, there are 3,000 at least, and we do have the most castellated landscape in Europe. Derek Bawn Ryan, he goes on by the Tipperary Antiquarian. You can find him on Facebook. He sent me this map recently, and he's analyzed the density of castles. And here's his map. And the density does correspond fairly well to the previous map. As you can see, the densest areas were the Pale around Dublin, County Louth, and County Westmeath. And then all through the rich southern farmlands, of course, there's very dense distribution of castles. So in the area that we're talking about, it was the Irish clans, not the Anglo-Normans, but the Irish clans that were building. And, you know, the dominant families in any area, the richest people around, will always build high prestige residences. And of course, they were building what everyone else was building and what was the fashion to build at the time, and that was a tower house. So the clans that we're talking about down here in this, which is my own study area, are the Mahonys, the McCarthys, the O'Sullivans, the O'Driscolls, the O'Donovans. Those are the main main families that were building castles down here. And they did have a wonderful example to copy from. This is Barry's Court Castle, one of the Barry's Castle. It's in East Cork. And what we find is that they're no longer adapting their own indigenous structures, such as castles and crannogs and ring forts. They're building in the style of the day, and that style is what we now know as the Tower House. Barry's Court Castle was built by Sean Ciothach Barry around 1400s. The Barrys were an Anglo-Norman family, but they'd intermarried with Irish families. They were one of those ones about whom it was typically said they were more Irish than the Irish themselves. The castle must have made a huge impression on the Irish chieftains of West Cork, and we see many of its features incorporated into their castles, probably built a bit later, maybe beginning, the West Cork ones, maybe beginning around 1440 and continuing on fairly well unchanged until about 1600 and even a bit later. Barry's Court is in the ownership of the state and was being operated by the OPW. But unfortunately, it's developed a crack in a wall, and that is a very dangerous thing to happen to a masonry structure. So it's currently closed. Now, I said I would talk a little bit about why conflict was hardwired into the very structure of Gaelic society. And that was firstly and foremostly through the way in which leadership was organized. Land was owned cooperatively, really, by agnatic descent groups called clans. Now, what do I mean by that, agnatic descent groups? Members descended from a common male ancestor, hence O'Mahony from Mahony, the common male ancestor, or O'Sullivan from Sullivan. The clan was a corporate entity with political and legal functions, particularly relating to land. So there was a lot of administration involved. But it also had responsibility for the conduct of its members. Within each clan, there was a ruling caste called the Derbfina. In each lordship, election to the chieftaincy lay solely. Now, remember, it was not primogeniture. It did not automatically go from father to son. It was an election, and election to the chieftaincy lay solely within the Derb Finna, or the ruling caste. Candidates for chieftaincy could be legitimate or illegitimate, but they had to descend from a common male ancestor in 4 generations. In other words, all candidates had to have a common great-grandfather. They also had to be sound of wind and limb. And so one of the ways in which you could disqualify somebody from becoming the clan chieftain is to blind him, for example, or worse. Now, this is John Speed's map of about 1600 to show how he portrayed the Irish. On the death of its chief or king, the surviving members of the Derb Finna would be the only ones to have a say in the election from their number of a new chief, and at the same time to elect his 6th successor. The chief was called the Taoiseach, the successor was called the Taoiseach, so the Taoiseach in waiting was the Taoiseach. And the frequent recitations of a clan's genealogy by its bards, and that was one of the chief functions of a bard, was therefore a reminder of who was currently in or out of the clan's Derb Finna, as much as it was a claim to ancient lineage. Now, the second cause for conflict was pressure on economic resources, both land and sea-based. In normal times, the clan and the Derb Finna were continually expanding. That's just population pressure. They could only be accommodated really by coercing other weaker landowning clans or collateral septs out of their lands. This was normally done by organized raids on their stock and dependents. The defeated chief would have to agree to whatever exactions were demanded. And if they couldn't meet them, they could be removed from their land or more probably become landless churls. Relatives of the chieftain could then take over the ownership of the land. Now, however, even though they were built as defensible structures, there's very little evidence that most castles were ever attacked or besieged until after the Battle of Kinsale in 1601. There were some battles, there were some besiegings, but not a lot. Tig O'Keefe, one of the authorities on medieval Irish buildings, says that castles or tower houses were defensive, and I quote, in the same way that a beware of the dog sign is defensive. And he says we should look at them as practical and symbolic structures. Now, if you look at the locations of the castles in West Cork, it's very obvious that the vast majority of these castles are coastal. And that's because they were also built to dominate the waters of West Cork and to control the fishery resources. They served as administrative centers, exploiting and controlling fishery resources in the area. Now, in between 1330 and 1600, climate changes caused ocean temperatures to warm in the North Atlantic. Migrating herring appeared in huge numbers off the southwest coast of Ireland, and salting became a boom industry. Salted herring were among the chief sources of preserved foods in medieval Europe, and they had to be salted within 24 hours of being caught to retain their flavor. You probably know that there were in many more fast days in medieval Europe than there are now. Dehina means the day of the fast, that's Friday. Day Cadine is the first day of fast, that's Wednesday. Day Deardine, the middle day, Dehina. And then, of course, there were all the special feast days. There was Lent, etc., etc. So during that time, you couldn't eat meat, but you could eat salted fish. And that was one of the reasons why this was such a staple of the diet. And of course, because once it was preserved, it would last through the winter. Now, into this vast shoals of herring and pilchards came fishermen from all over Europe, principally from Spain, Portugal, France, Brittany, and Britain. and of course local fishermen as well. And all of them paid dues to the local clan chieftains to fish in their waters. Visiting foreign vessels needed local facilities to land and dry their nets and process their catches, and dues from these activities formed a large part of the Lord's revenue. And the wealth generated by this activity in West Cork brought a new phase of castle building from about 1440 on, with existing castles being refurbished and new ones built, etc., etc. And indeed, they became fabulously wealthy. And we still know in West Cork that when we're dealing with overseas visitors, it's all about the fish. So because we're talking about fishing, and we're talking about control and domination of that resource, and there was a considerable export business in land-based goods as well. Fur, for example, was a huge export. Sighting of the castles was really important, and this is what's left of Dunbeacon Castle, one of the O'Mahony castles. So real strategic value lay with the sighting of the castle, because control of the waterways implied having a visual sighting of an anchorage and fishing grounds, and control of landing sites and victualling supplies and the collection of taxes and levies. So a castle was, and I quote, the focus for the lucrative organization of business interests. Here's another one, Dunmanus Castle. And note that castles could see the sea, and also in many cases could see each other. I'm going to come back to this particular castle. It's a very fine example of one of the early raised entry castles. We're talking about that in a minute. And as I said, the land-based, so this particular castle has a really good view of the sea all the way around down Dunmanus Bay, but also of the land in behind it as well. Because as I said, the land-based economy was also important, and the second biggest export after fish was cattle hides. Here's another one. This is called Black Castle, or Lamecon or Castle Point. We'll call it Black Castle. Very strategically sited, probably on an old promontory fort. Here's how you get to it nowadays. You have to cross this now concrete, in the old days wooden bridge, across a yawning chasm. And here's an aerial view of that. This is an O'Driscoll Castle. It's on Cape Clear. And the name of this castle was Dunanor, Fort of Gold. And you can see how impregnable it was. And there's some suggestion that the causeway to it was deliberately destroyed at some point. There's still quite a bit of it left. And this is an O'Driscoll Castle, and the castle, their main castle, where the Taoiseach dwelt, was in Baltimore, and it was called Dunashade, Castle of Jewels. So you can see that the wealth of these castles was pretty obvious right in their names. The O'Driscolls became fabulously wealthy and maintained a fleet of ships. They imported wine and fine dishes. And it was said, in fact, that Fineen O'Driscoll filled his well with wine to impress visitors because he could. This was the kind of ship that they had. They had a whole fleet of them, and they were pirates, really. They were forever raiding other fleets. They invaded Waterford on one or two occasions, and it was a fearsome sight to see their fleet bear down on you if you were fishermen from Portugal coming to fish the waters of West Cork. Now, they weren't all, because they were really wealthy, they had the wealth to indulge their own pursuits. Now, as I said, for the O'Driscolls, that meant conspicuous consumption, ostentation, flaunting of their wealth. But for the O'Mahanys, and in particular Fineen O'Mahony, whose castle this was, this is Rossbryn Castle, and this is the castle that I see from my window. For him, it meant scholarly pursuits. He this area, and you can see that there's very little except the final remains of this castle here. There's no evidence for anything else around it. It's all completely disappeared. But at one point, there was what was practically known as a university in this area. Fionnán O'Mahony was known as the Scholar Prince of Rossbryn. He was one of the most learned men in Europe. He surrounded himself with bards and scribes and poets, translators, and there are several manuscripts still extant in libraries in Europe and Britain, which were written in this castle in Rossbryn, including the first one ever to be written on paper rather than vellum. Now, one of the outcomes of the extensive fishing trade also was the close ties the Irish enjoyed with the Spanish, and the enormous commercial activity this involved, including importing and importing wine, for example. And these close links were of great concern to the crown because of the loss of revenue, first of all, but also because of the fears that they could facilitate a Spanish invasion of England. So let's take a look now at those castles that were built by the clans of West Cork and see what they look like. And this is where I'm going to be talking about what these castles look like, how they were built, and that will be very similar to your own clan castles. This is Dunmanus Castle. And there may have been two waves of castle building, one in the starting 1440, 1460, and most of these early castles were fairly simple. They had one outstanding characteristic, well, besides the fact that they were very uncomfortable. They had one outstanding characteristic, and that is that they were raised entry. They had two entrances, a ground level entry, as you can see here, and also a first floor entry. And you could say that this performed two functions. First of all, it separated the public space from the private space. So the upper or raised entry gave access to the upper floors and the private space. So immediately you went into that upper door, there was a staircase leading straight up, an intramural staircase leading straight up to the third floor. And that's where the chieftain's private residential space began. On other floors were accessed, the first and second floor were accessed, and possibly a mezzanine too, were accessed from that ground entry. So it's a defensive feature in that the ladder leading up to it could be thrown away if the castle was attacked, and there was no access to the upper floors from the lower entrance. But it's also, as I said, a separation of the public and private spaces. Now, architecturally, we'd call this style Gothic. Ornamental stonework was usually restricted to the opes or openings, windows, arrow loops, that kind of thing. And this also corresponds to the 15th and 16th dating horizons. Later on, we get larger windows during Elizabethan times. Now, note that the raised entry is offset from the ground level entry. Here's another one. This is the Black Castle, going back to Black Castle here. And in this example, the raised entry is right above the ground floor. Here's Ardentennant Castle. This was the home of the O'Mahony Taoiseach. And this is a raised entry as well. And what you'll see here when you look at these towers, they're tall, they're rectangular, they're probably 4 or 5 stories, 5 stories normally. But they're fairly Spartan. They were very uncomfortable, and there are some contemporary accounts of the lack of comfort. For example, they had no fireplaces. All of the windows except for the very top floor were tiny, so they would have been smoky. They would have been cold and uncomfortable and just fairly basic. Now, a bit later on, and we get ground entry. Rather than raised entry, the ground entry castles tended to be a little later and more likely to be inland. This is Ballinacarriga. And I want you to notice a couple of things. There is no raised entry. This is simply accessed through the ground entrance. And because of that, there were a few more defensive structures had to be built inside. And I'll show you those in a bit. Also, what you see in this is a matriculation. So a projecting balcony also, almost that is on the corner there. They have, sometimes there's gun loops as opposed to arrow loops. Ground entrance types, they generally are mentioned later in the documentary sources. And there seemed to have been another rush. So this was the second wave of ground entrance tower houses in the last half of the 1500s. And as I said, more likely to be inland as well. Now, let's take a look at what these castles looked inside. And once again, this is J.G. O'Donoghue's illustration. And I'm going to go through the architecture in some detail. And my aim here is to help you approach your own visits to castles armed with the knowledge of how they looked and functioned. So one of the things that, one of the names that you'll come across sometimes is a 10-pound castle. And what did that mean exactly? Well, there was a statute issued by Henry IV in 1429, and I'll quote it. It says, "It is agreed and asserted that every liege man of our Lord, the King of the said county," and he was referring to the Pale, "who chooses to build a castle or tower house sufficiently embattled or fortified, within the next 10 years, to wit, 20 feet in length, 16 feet in width, and 40 feet in height or more, that the commons of the said county shall pay to the said person to build the said castle or tower 10 pounds by way of subsidy." So as you know, in Ireland, we love a grant scheme. And this was the first of the grant schemes. So the castles in my research area were probably not part of this subsidy C plan. But the dimensions given may have led to the proliferation of certain plans. It may have provided a kind of a cookie cutter plan that gangs of masons could go around the country building these kinds of familiar plans. And the features of them are familiar from place to place. And these features persisted through time and space. They lasted for 200 years and all over Ireland. This particular castle is based on Kilcrea Castle near Aherla, just outside of Cork City, which was built by Cormac Lauder Moore, who was the chief of the McCarthy clan, and he was the builder of Blarney Castle. So you're probably familiar with that. Now, a few things before I go sort of into detail about it. I want you to note a few things. The first is that it has a commanding position in the landscape. These were statement residences. Remember, this was a time of great prosperity for the chieftains of this region. And like all wealthy people, they wanted to impress and they wanted to send a clear message of dominance. So it was the thing you saw in the landscape. And also notice that there are two other castles in the distance. I'm getting a little interference. If anybody's not on mute, perhaps they would mute themselves. I seem to be getting some interference. Okay, I'll carry on here. Note the two other castles in the distance. So intervisibility. Sometimes the townlands had more than one castle in them. Once you got a castle, your neighbor wanted to build a castle too. So castles were very often, and in West Cork, they were visible one from the other. And it could very well be that they had signals going one from the other when they saw, for example, fishing boats on the horizon, that they could signal where those boats were going. Note that the overall shape, it's taller than it's wide, it's rectangular, it's surrounded by a bawn, And the bawn has a bawn wall with battlements and corner towers. There are buildings in the courtyard. There are probably stables, but also possibly cooking facilities, and also possibly a hall where public business was conducted. This particular one had a shallow fosse or a shallow moat around it. Not all castles had that. Very few of them seemed to have had. And notice there was a village outside the walls, including a village church. So let's take a slightly closer look. And let me point out a few things. Now, we're so used to seeing bare stone walls and thinking that that's what castles would have looked like, that we forget that these castles were rendered to keep the rain out. And the render was colored. The basis was lime, but there's evidence of all kinds of additions that would have added color, including animal fats, blood, hair, flour shell, sand, stone rubble. The plasterer had his formula, and he also used whatever was available locally, materials that would increase cohesion or improve drying time. Irish place names abound in references to castles and colored castles. So if you just Google the word Castle Ireland and then put white, black, red, green in front of them and see how many red castles or white castles or black castles or green castles. And indeed, there's even a Castle Boy, which is Castle Bui, meaning yellow castle. Now, the render was essentially to keep the castle dry, and it had to be renewed occasionally because it did eventually wash away. And that's why few examples have survived from the 15th century. Any opening in the walls is called an ope. And all of them had the effect of letting light in, but the lower ones were smaller so that nobody could actually climb in through them. Besides window opes, there were arrow opes and later gun loops, arrow loops and gun loops. The larger windows are confined to the upper or residential floors. And in this case, the castle is shown to have a pitched slate or stone roof, but there's also evidence for thatched roof as well. Around the roof is a wall walk, and this is a very common feature of our castles. The projecting sort of balcony-like structure is known as a machicolation and is faced by a toothed or stepped battlement. Now, this particular style of battlement is known as Irish crenellations. So the crenellation is the battlement feature right on the top of the wall. And it's stepped or toothed tall parts, which were called merlin, and shorter parts, crenels. And of course, the idea is that you would hide behind the merlin to recharge your bow and step out into the crenel to shoot. Now, the other thing I want you to notice is halfway down the right-hand wall, you see a little figure on the wall there, and that's a Sheila na gig. We do find Sheila na gigs on Irish castles. In fact, I'll show you an example in a bit and talk a little bit about what that was. So the bawn or courtyard is surrounded by a bawn wall, which also has wall walks and crenellations and corner towers. Notice that this castle has chimneys, so more comfortable than the earlier towers. And the final thing I want to point out is the base batter. So the wall is splayed outwards at the base of the tower. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So how were these built? Well, this is a somewhat, it's very good drawing, but it doesn't really relate to a tower house. But what you see here, the master mason, and he's in charge of a large crew of masons, blacksmiths, carpenters, laborers, and they may have been traveling contractors, very much sort of how large-scale farms operate nowadays, with contractors coming in, doing all the work with their big equipment and then leaving again. There was a stoneworking tradition in Ireland, so there's no need to import labor from elsewhere, but we do know that a lot of the early castles were based on models from Britain and France, and there may have been experienced English, Welsh, or French builders among the crews as well. Notice the use of scaffolding, and the scaffolding was inserted into holes in the wall. These are called put log holes because you put the logs into them, and later they were usually filled in, but we can see some examples of them. The outside stones were sometimes cut and shaped, and all the windows and archway stones were shaped, and the word we use there is chamfered. The basic construction technique is called rubble construction. The wall is shaped and the interior is filled with rubble and mortar. Mortar is a mixture of sand and water with a binder added, and in medieval times that binder was usually lime. Now that technique has not changed. This is the wall. This is a wall at my house. This is Diarmuid, who doubles as the postman. And he, in his spare time, loves to build with stone. So you can see what he's doing. He has faced up the outside of the wall and he's filling the middle in with rubble. And his particular mortar is cement. And that's what it looks like. And that technique has not changed since medieval times. So let's take a look at some of the castles and in West Cork and see how they were built. This is Castle Donovan, castle of the Donovan clan, and it was built on a solid rock platform, and that's very typical of the castles in West Cork and elsewhere. Now, the upside of this is that it is indeed solid. It's a very solid way, creates a very solid platform. The downside is that once something like this starts to slide, it's game over. And indeed, many castles in West Cork have completely disappeared with no trace, leaving no trace. And some of that may have been that once it starts to go, it's gone. Here's Rinkellisky Castle. This is an O'Driscoll castle, and it was once a lot taller than it is now. So notice in this one, notice how the bottom of the wall splays out, and this is called the base batter. And there were two reasons for having a base batter. One is these were pretty heavy structures, and the base batter gave a wide and solid base to build on, just made common sense. But it was also defensive. It was harder to breach such a thick wall, and objects dropped from the top shattered and bounced outwards. Here's Ballinacarriga again. I did use this picture once before, and this is a picture of the O'Hurley clan. Wonder if we have any O'Hurleys here. This is a ground entry castle, and there are two ways of defending the door. But for the moment, all I want you to do is note the hole at the side of the door, at the left-hand side of the door, and also the Síle na gig. And you will see the Síle na gig high up on the wall above, there's two windows going straight up on the right-hand side, and above the second window, you'll see the Síle na gig, and here's a close-up of it. Now, you all know already, these are female figures with exposing their exaggerated genitals, and lots of theories about them. There was one at Glanworth, for example, the chamber tower I showed you earlier. They may have been built into castle walls to attract the evil eye and thereby protecting the inhabitants from it. The evil eye was thought to be a kind of a supernatural force that casts or reflects a malevolent gaze. So if it cast the malevolent gaze, it would catch the Síle na gig and thereby protect the inhabitants from it. This castle also has this corner matriculation, and when a matriculation like this is on a corner, it's usually called a bartizan. So matriculations in general seem to belong to a slightly later period. The raised entry castles of the 15th century don't seem to have them. They're more 16th century ground entry castles. Here's what's left of a tower house at Abbeymahan between Drimoleague and Courtmacsherry. And the only stone to be shaped or chamfered were the cornerstones. And cornerstones were known as quoins, Quoins. Now, the fact that they were nicely shaped, and the only other stones that you see around here, the upper window has some chamfered stones as well. makes them, unfortunately, also quite attractive as building materials. So here is Carriganas Castle, and this is the O'Sullivan clan. And the technical term when you see something like this is that the coins have been robbed. So I'm not accusing anybody of anything. I'm not saying who has robbed these, but the technical term that archaeologists use when material is missing like this is that these stones have been robbed. This is Black Castle again. The individual skill or style of the mason is, I think we can see it in this wall. Some of them preferred very square blocks, some preferred rectangular slabs. And so as your gaze travels up the wall, I think you can see that some of the courses are more carefully built than others. And I'm tempted to think that some of these masons had come back after a liquid lunch and just sort of slapped up whatever stones were to hand and said, "Yeah, it will do," whereas others, of course, were much more careful. This is Dunlock Castle, also known as Three Castle Head, one of the most beautiful castles in West Cork. And it's a very skillful use of flat slabs on the outside. It's beautifully, beautifully built. And you can see the rubble interior where some of the stones have fallen away. This is Ardentennant Castle. As I said, this is an O'Mahony castle, and so was Three Castle Head. This is an O'Mahony castle that was the home of the Taoiseach. It's a raised entry castle. And you can see that the base batter has been robbed. Also, some of the coins going up and all the chamfered stone from the lower doorway has been robbed. And of course, this creates real worries about the stability of a structure like this. Here's some loops. Now, here's a couple of loops from Carriganas Castle. The one on the right is very tiny indeed. The one on the left, slightly larger. But you can see, especially the one on the right, doesn't present much of a target to an attacker. Here's the inside of one of those loops, and you can see that it's very deeply splayed, and that's to allow for the head and shoulders of the archer. Here are some other loops. Here's a Kilcrea, cruciform-shaped loop. Kilcrea was a very beautifully constructed castle. Here it is from the inside. It allowed a range of motion, so deeply splayed would allow more light in, but also allow the head and shoulders of the archer. And this particular configuration of cruciform shape gave a range of motion up and down, side to side. Here's the wall walk at Kilcrea, and note the sentry box on the corner, and also the way the flagstones are shaped and slanted to carry water off the wall walk and away from what would have been the roof in the middle. Here's a wall walk. This is Dalkey Castle in Dublin, just one of the suburbs in Dublin. Very fun place to visit, by the way, if you ever get a chance to go. It's now the Heritage Centre in Dalkey. And the lady of the castle was showing my husband around. It was great fun to sort of do that tour. Back to Castle Donovan again. The matriculations or projecting balconies, in this case are on the corner only, but look at the holes that run along the top of the wall. Now, these could be part of the drainage from the wall walk, but they might also have been holding the foundations for wooden matriculations known as hoardings. And we know that many of the Irish castles did have hoardings. And unfortunately, I couldn't find a single illustration of hoardings in place in an Irish castle. But so I've used one from Carcassonne just to show what a wooden hoarding would have looked like. Here's the Dunlock or Three Castle Head. You can see what an amazing, amazing place it is. If you ever get down to West Cork, you must visit. It's not a tower house surrounded by a bawn wall in that classic sense that we've been talking about. It's actually a curtain wall punctuated by three towers. Now, there's a reference in one of the annals to a castle built here by Donogh na Hamracha O'Mahony, Donogh the Migratory, in 1207, soon after the Norman invasion. But it's obviously quite different in overall form from other castles in the area, but it makes sense as the best way to defend a narrow piece of land between the lake and the sea. So where I'm standing is actually sea cliffs, and the lake is on the left there, straight ahead. So there's a narrow entrance to a promontory, and this curtain wall, probably a promontory fort originally, this curtain wall has been built across. And there's no evidence that it was, there's no evidence that these particular structures date to anything earlier than the 15th century, but there may well have been earlier structures that were known as, where the word Casthail was used in the annals. So this really falls squarely into 15th century building technology. Here's another castle, Carriganas again, an O'Sullivan Castle, excellent use of a natural defense, and in this case, of course, the gorge of the river. And finally, this is not in West Cork, this is in Killarney. Some of you may have visited this. This is Ross Castle, a castle of O'Donoghue Moore. And just as a bit of a quiz now, we've come to midterm quiz. I'll go through some of the features and you see what you can identify. See how well you have been listening. So can you see the Irish crenellations? Can you see a corner matriculation or bartizan? Can you identify various kinds of opes, arrow loops, and window opes, and the window opes getting larger as you go up? Can you see the base batter? Can you see that it has been built on a solid rock foundation? And can you see the bawn wall? And the only other thing I want to point out to you is that sort of square hole just above the rock foundation, and I'll deal with that in a minute. Okay, so that's basically what the castles look like on the outside. Let's take a look inside. And once again, we're really indebted to J.G. O'Donoghue for his cutaway drawings. Now, before I sort of go through the features one by one, let's start with the more or less the overall look inside. First of all, I want you to notice that this is a mixture of stone floors and wooden floors. So this is what they call a double vaulted castle. So this had two vaults inside, and the first vault incorporated the ground floor and the second floor. The second vault incorporated the kitchen, what's been imagined as the kitchen, and the Lord's bedroom. And so the top room, which is the solar or private area, dining area and guest area for entertaining guests, is on stone, as is the kitchen, and the other floors are wooden. Now, also, I want to ask you to note the stairs. They're all built inside the wall, so they're mural stairs. They're both straight and spiral. So the main entry has a set of straight stairs going up to the first floor, and above that it's spiral all the way to the top floor, and then there's another set of straight stairs. No, that's a spiral too. That's right, going up onto the wall walk. There's a mural chamber. So if you look at the area that's been imagined as a kitchen and look to the right of that, you can see that there's a chamber inside the walls. And in this case, it's imagined as a sleeping chamber. As the floors go up, the bottom floor, the ground floor, is used for storage. The second one as living for soldiers. The third one is kitchen. The fourth one as the chieftain's bedchamber. the fifth one as the solar or living area, and the top as, of course, the battlements. The ground floor entry and, of course, the fireplaces mark this castle as one of the later ones, more comfortable, and the ground floor entry. You can see, of course, small windows on the lower floors and larger ones giving it a lot more light on the upper floors. You can see that this castle has the Irish crenellations and the matriculation. Let's take a closer look. So let's start with the ground floor. First 3 floors. And as I said, this is based on Kilcrea Castle. So the ground entry lets in, so here you have a ground entry with what looks like a great metal grill over the door. And above, you go in through this door into one small chamber. The door closes behind you and you're kind of trapped, really. The door closes behind you. There's a locked door to your left and a locked door straight ahead. But up above you is somebody looking down. It's a trap door or a hole above, and that hole, of course, is known as a murder hole. Now, it could have been just an inspection hole. It could have been we see you, what state your business before you're let in. But of course, also, it's very much a defensive feature. And this murder hole still exists. Let's take a look. This is Kilcrea Castle. So you step in, here's the small room that you step into. Note that I'll just go back for a moment. Note that there's a door to the left, a door straight ahead of you. And once you're in, there's a door behind you. And and above you is the murder hole. This is Kilcrea, and there it is. Now, notice that once you're inside too, it could be that the door is how is the door going to close behind you? This is by means of a hinged yett, and yett is related to the word for gate. So you can see that there's somebody in a small little sentry room there to the left, and they have a chain and they're able to pull the gate closed behind the intruder. And this is a feature that we find at Castletonovan. Here's the left-hand side of Castletonovan entry. You can see a couple of sort of hinge holes there. And on the right-hand side, you can see this yett hole, the one that's where the chain is pulled through into the sentry hole. And by the way, on the left there, you see the bar hole. So once the normal door is closed, a bar can fit into those holes. And here's inside that sentry hole, you can see the construction that the chain would have gone through. Let's take a look at Dunmanus Castle. This is one of the earlier or raised entry, one of the less comfortable castles, let's say, but very interesting structure. And because it's fairly intact, you can see some of the features. So I'm going to point out that we have a ground floor, and we're going to go through that entry into the ground floor. We have a raised entry, which goes up to the upper floors, which I've never been on. And we have a dungeon, which I'll show you in a minute. So once you go in through the ground entry, this is what you see. This is a vault, the first vault in Dunmanus. There is, you can see that there are projecting corbels that would have supported a second floor. And I'll show you how that would have looked a little later on. And also projecting corbels for a kind of a mezzanine. Now there's no entry to the upper floors from here. That door that you see over there does not give onto the upper floors. And so how were these vaults built? Well, through the means of a scaffolding that was then rounded. And once the scaffolding was built, what they did was they laid mortar on top of, they laid a sort of a wicker framework on top of the rounded arch they laid mortar on top of that wicker framework, and then they started to build the stone arch in a kind of a corbelling technique. And what's interesting is that once the arch was taken down, once the wooden structure was taken down, the impression of the wicker framework remained. This is it from Castletonovan, and it remained in the ceiling and is evidence of this technique, which is called wicker centering. This is the dungeon in Castletonovan, in Dunmanus. And the dungeon, we only know of it really because there's a big hole in the wall, and so we can see into it. And the only entry to this was through what's called a drop hole. Now, more recent thinking is that this probably wasn't a dungeon. It may have been, and it would have been incredibly effective dungeon, an oubliette really. But these were more likely to be strong rooms where the valuables were kept, and the room above it may have been used by the castle accountant. The door that we came into the vault, the ground entry at Dunmanus, you can see the bar hole where a bar would have been fitted to close the door, and an eye stone and spud stone are still in place to hang the door. This is Raheen Castle. It's an O'Donovan castle. And I love this castle because you can see it's a wonderful cross section. Now, supposedly it was hammered to bits by Cromwell, and there are still cannonballs stuck in the wall. But what I like about it is that you can see the vault, and there were two functions for these vaults. One was for fire prevention, which was really effective if there was a fire on the lower floor. And remember, a lot of these didn't have fireplaces, chimneys. They had braziers in the middle of the floor. If the floor, if there was a stone vault, it would hopefully prevent fire from going up into the upper floors, but also for structural cohesion. A lot of these, the ones that have survived best, are single arch or double arched castles. There was another style of castle. This is Three Castle Head or Dunlock, and you can see by the way the wicker centering has left its impressions you can still see the impressions of the wicker centering in the archways here at Dunlock. This was, however, a slightly different way. Instead of a continuous vault, you had archways, and then those archways were covered by these thick slaty slabs. This technique has been used in various castles in West Cork. This is Castletonovan again. It's got no arches, no interior arches above a very basic one on the in the basement. It's a fireplace on a higher floor and no vaults whatsoever. This is Rossbryn Castle, the one I look down on. That is not my house in the background. You can still see a lot of detail, despite the fact that this is very rudimentary. You can see that the staircases were within the walls. You can see the arch construction. This is one of those which had arches rather than vaults. This is Dúnanór on Cape Clear Island. Once again, one of those that had arches rather than vaults. And you can see it was raised entry, the straight mural stairs going up from the raised entry, and you can still see some remnants of the wall walk there. This is at Three Castles again, and very fine construction, those flat slabs, I love them. So you can see the remains of the staircase. Each tread was individually carved and sort of wound around a central point or newel formed by the shape of each step. This is one of those. This is Kilcrea Castle again. And as you can see, it's beautifully constructed, much finer construction. This was a very high status castle. Just to show you a nice a window, very deeply splayed, so that even though even though the ope itself is quite small, if the sun was in the right quarter, it would let in more light than you think. This is Castle Salem, a wonderful castle that's still, that's been partly restored and which has a 17th century house added onto it, just outside of Rosscarbery. And this is one of the ones that was built by a woman, not a man. It was almost certainly built around 1470 by Catherine Fitzgerald, who was the daughter of Thomas, the second Earl of Desmond. And she married Fineen McCarthy Ray, and it was one of several castles built by women. This one was known as Ben Duff or Bandov, the Dark Lady. And there's lots of stories about the Dark Lady visiting people who are in this castle. This is a very interesting castle. It's also visitable. The owner will open it and show you around. And it was also visited by Quakers, in fact, several times by William Penn. Now, I know that this is the subject that you're all dying to know about. Was there indoor plumbing in these castles? And the answer is yes. For their time, they were very advanced. And this is the Biffy in Castle Salem. This is the chute under the Biffy in Balnacarrega. You can see the chute goes all the way down to the ground. And this is JG's rendering of how these would have worked. So as you can see, this particular one is a kind of a mural garderobe. The word garderobe used meaning keep clothing, because the idea was that the ammonia would keep the fleas away. But in this case, you can see that there's a double, there's a two-banger up above, and then the lower one, also there's a garderobe on the lower level as well. And the chute goes all the way down to the bottom. And remember, I asked you to take a look at that square hole at Rosscastle. And you can see one here, right at the bottom of this wall. This is Dunmanus Castle. And you can also see that at Dunmanus Castle, there is a divided chute. So there were two different garderobes on two different levels. And here's the inspector of drains, my husband, taking a look at the garderobe chute at Kilcray Castle. And here's a mural chamber, a typical mural chamber. I'm not sure how comfortable they would have been for sleeping in. They were probably used for storage. Now let's take a look at the residential floors, the upper floors. Of course, bigger windows, fireplaces, much more comfortable for the Taoiseach or Taoiseach, the chieftain, his family, his lady, and for guests. The painting, by the way, in his bedchamber is very well documented. There are traces, lots of traces of painted walls, for example, found at Barry's Court in the excavation there. This is based on Kilcray, once again, and here's what's left of the solar. You can go all the way up to the top of it at Kilcray. And you can see that on the right-hand side, a fireplace has actually been inserted where a window originally was. And this is Balnacarga. What are we all looking at? And you can see the beautiful cobblestone floor there too. And this is what we're looking at. Okay, I appear to be frozen. Okay, I'm sorry, my screen is frozen, so I'm just going to stop sharing for a second and start again. Okay, just a minute. Oops. All right, are we back? Okay, this is what we're looking at. Carvings are fairly unusual, and this crucifixion image from Balnacarga And here's a reconstruction of what Balnacarrega may have looked like in its heyday. And I'm not sure where this dining hall is. I thought maybe it was Donegal Castle, but it's not. It's somewhere else. And I haven't labeled my photograph, so I don't know where it is. Now, this was the solar where guests were entertained. And of course, there's this famous image, the MacSweeney Feast from John Derrick's book published in 1581, showing the head table. And there's the Lord, the priest behind him giving a blessing, another one on his left-hand side, his lady on his right-hand side, and the bard reciting probably his genealogy, telling tales, accompanied by a harpist, while the feast is being prepared off to the left. And I can assure you that what is being cooked over the open fire is not a baby. It's, although it looks like one, it's an animal of some kind. And intriguingly, hopefully you can see on the right-hand side, the two entertainers. These were professional farters, and apparently they were very talented in what they could do with their bodily functions. Now, of course, nobody lives in these castles, or very few people live in these castles anymore. So what happened? What happened to the clan chiefs? What happened to their castles? Well, during the reign of Henry VIII, around 1541, there was the surrender and regrant system, which really spelled sort of the beginning of the end of the old Gaelic order. The chieftains were compelled to surrender their lands and be regranted. So their traditional titles were taken from them, and they were given titles, British titles, Sir this or Lord that. And there was more to it than that. They had to swear to dress in the English fashion, to speak only English, to pass on their lands through primogeniture, not through the Derb Finna, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, many of them went through this ceremony, but in fact, carried on life much as before. But it did spark the beginning of the end. But really, what put paid to at least in West Cork, to the real power of the Irish clans was the Battle of Kinsale and the 9 Years' War. The old Gaelic order declined, and after that, a new generation of planters arrived to take possession of the land. For example, in the O'Mahonys, by the time of the Down Survey in 1657, all of the O'Mahony castles were untenanted and described as ruinous. And by the end of the 17th century, not a single one remained in Irish hands. So I'm going to use Togher Castle as an example. This was built by Taig an Forsa, Taig of the Forces McCarthy, and it was eventually inherited and lived in by Taig an Duna, Taig of the Fort, who led the McCarthy forces in the rebellion of 1642. Now, it's not a classic tower house. I think you can see that it's almost as broad as it is wide. In fact, it's kind of a transition between a tower house and a later fortified Elizabethan manor. And you can see the Elizabethan fireplace chimneys on top. It's got a tin roof that is much more recent. But he led the McCarthy forces in the rebellion of 1642. The land was forfeit and given over to planters called the Hors. And the condition that Taig an Duna was left in was described by a contemporary poet. So I'm going to read this in Irish first, and then I will read the translation. So the poem says, Ní Taig an Duna tanam, ach Taig gan dún gan dangan, Taig gan bó gan coppel, imahanin, ishel, datag, Taig gan ban, gan lanav. Not Taig of the Dún thy name, but Taig without dune, without stronghold, Taig without cow, without house, in a low, smoky little cabin, Taig without wife, without child. And I don't know, I almost cry every time I read that. It's just so sad. Togher was one of the last castles to be built. And after that, really what you start to get now is the domination of a form known as the fortified manor house, which is essentially kind of a Tudor later building. This is Coppinger's Court, and it's the new gold standard of mansion. There are many in better condition than this. So let's take a look. What does the future hold for our castles? Well, first, the bad news. In my study area, there were at least 41 castles originally. And here's what that looks like now. So the green ones are the ones that are stable. They're stable or they're reconstructed. They're not about to fall down. The blue ones are endangered. They're in tough shape. There's not much of them left. They may disappear soon. The red ones are gone. They have simply disappeared. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. This is Ardagh. There was once a castle on top of this hill. There's absolutely nothing left, only a few stones. It was an O'Driscoll castle. There's a corner left of a castle on Whiddy Island. That was an O'Sullivan castle. This is Monteene Castle. It's a castle of the Monteene sept of the McCarthys. This one won't last much longer. The stones have been robbed, and really it's hard to see how it can keep standing. And here's the wall of the Bawn at Old Court. I always think, like just one puff of wind, one single stone giving way there, and the whole thing is going to come down. So I'm sorry, my screen has stopped. So let me just do this one more time. Sorry about that. We'll try this one more time. All right. Hopefully that'll do it. So the good news. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. This is what Black Castle looked like when it was bought by Niall Hyde from Dublin, who bought it and renovated it with the help of local people. You can see that the base batter has been robbed. It's in terrible shape. There's no roof. That's what the base batter looked like. This is what it looks like nowadays. He's replaced the base batter with the help of very skilled local stonemasons. He's kept a course to show where that happened. And here he is. Here's Robert and Niall enjoying a cup of tea in his castle, and he absolutely loves it. Here's his kitchen. It's great fun to go there. This is Rinkelisky Castle. It's been renovated also. Remember I showed you the picture of the vault at Dunmanus? Well, here's what that construction looks like in Rinkelisky. This is the ground floor, and this is the second floor reached by a staircase and the mezzanine. And when you paint it white inside, it really helps to brighten up the interior as well. Here's the top floor. Wouldn't you love to wake up to that every morning? And the garderobe in the garderobe chamber. This is Baltimore Castle. It's a 17th century fortified manor, and it's been beautifully restored by the McCarthys, and you can go and visit it. And there's very often concerts and things, and that's what it looks like inside. This is it's really the twin of Dunmanus Castle. This is what it looked like when it was bought for renovation purposes. This is what it looks like today. Absolutely magnificent. It's the work of Jeremy Irons, the actor. This is Kilcoe Castle. One of my favorite castles of all time, because it's just been so beautifully restored. And here it is glowing amber-like in the evening sun. Now, so far, what I've shown you is castles restored like Barry's Court, taken over by the state, huge amounts of money put into it, but no longer open because of a crack in the wall. Castles that have been privately renovated. We do have lots of ruined castles, but there's no public money really to preserve them, and they're at the mercy of the elements and people. So where does the hope lie? Hopefully in people like this. So I'm now going to stop sharing my screen, and hopefully everybody was able to hear everything.
Thank you so much, Finola. That was a really wonderful presentation and a real insight into the Irish Tower houses. For me, the emphasis on the sort of economic resources needed to build such a castle was really interesting. And it's something I haven't really read a huge amount into, the sort of clans or chieftains who were building these castles, how they were able to acquire the resources to build them. And you mentioned the fishing industry in West Cork. And I know from my own clan castle in Ulster, as Corribs of the pilgrimage island of Lough Derg, the income to build such castles potentially came from those pilgrims, the medieval pilgrims making their way, and the hospitality provided by the clan to those pilgrims. So it'd be a really interesting study, I think, to look at the economics around Irish castle building, and maybe there's a clan essay competition entry there for someone at some point in the future. I was just going to maybe offer it open to some questions from our participants here. Maybe I could just start off with one question. You mentioned about the masons who were employed to build these castles. Is there any information in relation to those masons? Were they building off plans? Had they got a sort of template for castle building? And also were they sort of employed to tour the country building tower houses over a period of time? And I guess were they taking any inspiration from other locations? Scotland, for instance, springs to mind, that some of the similarities between particularly the later manor houses and Scottish architecture.
Yeah, the later manor houses for sure. The earlier castles, particularly the masonry castles, you can see Welsh counterparts. I think that they were coming from Pembroke Castle, for example. Is such a classic. There are people who have sort of looked at the French, the Flemish, the Welsh and English castles and seen really good parallels. The Tower House appears to have been, it wasn't unique to Ireland, but it became the defining sort of feature of castle building in Ireland. And I think there are more tower houses here than anywhere, and it's kind of an Irish form of castle building. Yes, they definitely plans. There were accounts of early importation of masons, but that didn't necessarily last for very long. And like I said, there were skilled stonemasons already in Ireland, building in stone. So the idea of the roving bands, I think, is good. I mean, there wasn't enough. They would build a castle, how long it would take, I don't know, a year or two, and then move on to the next one. So the O'Mahonys here, for example, had a string of castles all along the coast. And the supposition is that there was one gang, who built the first one, then the second one, then the next one.
Thank you.
Oh, and I wanted to say too about pilgrimage and the medieval economy around pilgrimage. Very, very significant. And if you had a piece of the True Cross or the pilgrims, the relics of a saint or something like that, the economics of that were enormous. And so, yes, it was very much in the interests of a clan chieftain to have something like that and to build some kind of receptacle for it, whether that was a cathedral or a church or a reliquary of some kind, anything to encourage pilgrimage.
Thank you. Maybe I can offer out to other questions.
Yes, this is Michael. So I've experienced restoring a castle in Galway, and some of you may know we had some nice parties over there in Meal. So it was an experience. I just wanted to say, in my studies of castles on this, and of course I'm not an academic as you are, tower houses, they're called, they really are big castle in miniature. they all have the same features. So you mentioned the yid, the murder hall, their interlocking doors when in the entrance in the lobby. And this is very much the concept, of a drawbridge, except there is no drawbridge, but confining any enemy into a certain area to kill him. And the entrance of a castle is generally the most protected area. Something that is very specific to Irish castles or tower houses is the bartizan. It's a miniature of a tower. It does protect generally the corners to avoid mining or undermining the corners or sowing. And there are many examples that have been quite effective. So dropping stones, but also hot water, hot wine, lime on attackers that would actually try to undermine the corners by taking stones out. One example of the ingenuity of the architects is that the yurt and the wooden door very often has the same hinges. So they go through the wall. So if you try to pull the iron yurt or grid, well, you can't really, because you need to pull the wooden door through the wall as well. So it explains why those hinges actually survive. But what was striking, and this is my question, in Ballinderry, we found out, and the architect, David Newman Johnson, who formerly worked at the OPW, found out the measurements of the castle were exactly metric. So the ground floor is 5 meters by 5 meters, amazingly. And so my question is, undoubtedly, there were schools of stonemasons from one county to the other, or one region to the other. We can see that similar features in castles, at least in the Barony of Clare in Galway. Do we have any sense of the measurements? Because this metric thing, of course, the metric system did not exist, in 1450 or 1500. Do we have any sense of the measurements they used to build those complex buildings?
Yeah, I think people who study medieval stonemasons say that there were standardized measurements, of course, that they used and they brought with them in the form of yardsticks or the equivalent, and certainly the statute appeared to specify a sort of a minimum set of measurements in order to qualify for the grant. But beyond that, I can't comment.
Thank you very much. I think this is a fascinating question. There's also a sense, and I don't know if this is correct, that bonds very often cover the surface of 1/3 of an acre. I don't know if that's true. That may depend from region to region as well. But anyway, thank you.
And it wasn't just the measurements, wasn't it? It was also the proportions and the sort of the golden mean, or that this would be exactly half of that, and that extension would be, so those measurements became really important as well.
Yeah. So I would like to testify as well that living in a castle when there is a fireplace or two can be very comfortable, provided it is waterproof. And you mentioned the plastering. I mean, if we look at the Scottish example, they've put 2 inches of hoarding. It was a huge undertaking in lime, so it would breathe and move along with the stones. So thank you very much, Finola. Great presentation.
Okay.
It can be very smoky as well, Michael.
Yes, that's true. It depends if you have a bird's nest in the fire in the chimney flue. Correct.
Question, please.
Sorry, Luke, Luke, you have a question?
Yes, Finola, thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. Can you hear me there?
Yes.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. I just wonder, it's quite instructive, I think, when you compare tower houses between different counties. So, for example, I'm quite involved in historical research pertaining to Thomond or County Clare, essentially. And just a reference to that graphic, which you put up there by Derek Ryan or Derek Bourne, I think it's 110 castles, tower house sites. In fact, there's about 235 which has been identified for County Clare. Martin Breen and Richard O'Croneen for the last 30 years. A lot of surveys of this. So just to the point that, you know, the Gaelic elite in the 15th century were quite prolific in terms of the construction of these. But what I find interesting is you're saying, at least in the West Cork situation, that you have essentially two phases of construction. The first phase sort of post 1440s, and then you have a second phase later. I know, again, contrasting with County Clare, you have the chief residence, the Caput residence of the McNamaras at Danganny-Vigan, which is just outside the town or the village of Quinn. That quite recently, the last couple of years, myself and others have done C14 testing of that, and that seems to show a date of mid-14th century, so quite early on. Now, of course, the area south of there, Tradree, which is essentially historically associated with Bunratty, was sub-infeuded for about 50 years by the Normans until they defeated in 1318. And it's quite possible that the Gaelic Irish in that area, particularly the McNamaras, because that was their hereditary patrimonial lands, were essentially copying some of the constructions of the Normans at Bunratty and more particularly at Quinn. Because afterwards, of course, after Quinn is destroyed in about the 1290s, then the McNamaras found a Franciscan friary on top of the ruins of that castle. And you can still see some of the what was previously encapsulated building as the foundations of the friary, which is quite amazing, that continuity. But it seems to me that actually we might need to think about putting the dial back a little bit in terms of when a lot of the construction of Gaelic tower houses actually occur. And so, for example, with Danganny-Vigan, what you seem to be seeing there is a hall house, or if you want to use that term, I know it's controversial in some ways, but a transition from a squat structure to a tower house occurring when that was built in about 1350, and then later from 1400s onwards, you have about 60 tower houses being constructed in the lordship of Clan Cullen, which is essentially East Clare, by the McNamaras, a huge expansion after the defeat of the Normans. So it sort of shows, I think, that that's quite a good sort of microcosm of that type of development. The other thing to note, I think, is also the correlation between not only fertile agricultural land and the construction of tower houses, because you see this in County Clare. If you go back to that map where you had the whole distribution of tower houses throughout Ireland, you see a clear southeast to northwest axis in respect of County Clare. Now that essentially runs along the valleys and the productive land that you'll see in County Clare. So it makes sense that you have a higher agricultural surplus in which then to put into the construction of castles in the sort of Gaelic revival period of the late 14th and into the 15th century. But also, I know my own studies has found a clear correlation, maybe a causation between where tower houses situate and the leading sept lineages of, for example, the McNamaras. So essentially they're setting up their own, the heads of the septs of the McNamaras have their own castles. And this speaks to your earlier point around sort of Gaelic society and the fact that the lordly lineages are essentially pushing down other less powerful, less wealthy families, and then essentially building castles and making them subordinate to themselves. But my long-winded question is, I'm quite interested in the Gaelic learner class, and what you see there is quite a different set of features happening. So not only are they using, by the 16th century, you see poets, etc., living in castle residences, poets and chroniclers. The Omar Conora from Ardkyle in near Bunratty in County Clare is one example, but you also see the learned families remaining resident in these antique residences like the Cahers, the Cashels and the Raths. And up until the 16th and into the 17th century, I mean, we have evidence from 1675 that the O'Davern Law School at Cahir McNaughton in the Burren are actually living in a ring fort, a cashel essentially, ring fort, which would date pre-12th century. And they're continuously occupying that until the 17th century. We have the MacBroda or the MacBrody poets at Knockna Elban Crannog in West Clare. And it's almost a deliberate attempt to ensure continuity with these sites of antiquity. But it's particularly the learned families who are doing this. So I wonder if you have any sort of observations on that, and if you find a similar manifestation, maybe with the Igalig or the O'Daly family of the Sheep's Head Peninsula in West Clare, in West Cork, sorry.
Yes, well, I think I have 2 or 3. I'm trying to remember now the points I wanted to make as you were talking. First of all, about pushing the dates back. I think the more excavations there are, the more evidence there is that the dates are probably a bit earlier than we thought. So, for example, Barry's Court, which is the caput of the Barry family, the dates for there were 1300 and 1390s, 1380s.
Yeah.
So I kind of rounded up to about 1400 because they're the dates are around there, but that's much earlier than the analytic references to the and the kind of construction evidence to the West Cork ones. Secondly, about the O'Daly's, yes, they had their own castle, and that was on the Sheep's Head at Kilcrohana, Lake Farranamana. There's not much of it left. There's enough to see that it was a castle, and the evidence is, I think that the learned families, as you call them, were just almost equal in prestige to the clan chieftains and the heads of septs, because them and the Brehons, they were so highly regarded, and of course granted land to build their castles. So we do have an O'Daly castle there. It's a bit controversial as to what it actually consists of. There's a set of old houses or cabins that may be just pre-famine cabins, but they're always described as the O'Daly Bardic School.
Yes.
However, there's a building close by, which is just a private residence, which appears to have some aspects of medieval building technology there as well. So yeah, I mean, now I'm kind of lost because but anyway, yeah, there's earlier, I think. There's going to be a lot of sort of downward pressure on the dating horizon, and for the learned families, absolutely, they were building their own castles. And
Indeed, thank you.
Gareth?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
yes,
Yes, Gareth?
Yes, sorry. First of all, thank you. That was brilliant, informative, detailed, wonderful lecture. My question is, have you ever come across evidence of transition of tower house sites to being used as latter-day defense towers like Martello, etc.?
no, but when the signal towers were built in all around the coast, 80 of them or whatever, following the Napoleonic invasion. When those signal towers were built, they were almost copycats of the tower houses. They had sort of machicolations. They had raised entries. They had the big stone constructions, and in fact, if you don't look carefully, sometimes you think, oh, that's a tower house. No, wait a minute, it's not quite a tower house. So copycat. Now I'm trying to think about whether any of the original tower houses were repurposed as signal towers or such like. And there may be, I just can't think of them off the top of my head, or I haven't experienced them myself. Do you know of any?
Well, I know there's one that I have that I'd like to investigate, because I think that may be a repurposed, it's a derelict signal tower that I think is perhaps a repurposed tower house. It's in West Clare. Luke and I will be visiting it someday.
All right, great.
If I may have another question, Sean, can I?
Sorry, just very quickly, Michael.
Yeah, just very quickly. So one remark I wanted to you mentioned the garderobes, and I think garderobes are fascinating because they are the symptom of the change of society. And there are no garderobes in the buildings such as Coppinger court, and so on and so forth. So I read somewhere that it was simply because the domesticity was more available for the more wealthy. So they didn't have to go to the bathroom themselves. They just had a bucket in their room. So, but somebody had to take care of the bucket. But really my question relates to heraldry and symbols. So a week ago, we had a presentation on heraldry, and which I delivered. I could find only one example of heraldry during the Gaelic period, which is in Togher Castle, where you can see the coat of arms of the McCarthys. However, on many castles, you can see knots, and sometimes two knots. I was speaking to a local historian in Galway, and he said, well, those are clan knots. And remember that in British and in French, the greatest family also had knots. That was part of their heraldry badge, I would say. And I was wondering if there's any sense, or you came across any possibilities that those could be family knots, such as in Ballynacurriga Castle. There are some interlaces that looks like knots. Or is this a theory, or does it have any avenue for further investigation? I'd like to have your feeling, if that's okay.
I know who could answer your question.
All right.
And that's Colm Horahan, who's done a great study of all the medieval carved corpus. But I can't.
Okay.
You're right in that Togher is the only one I know of in this area, at least with a coat of arms. And there's several carvings, not just the one I showed you, but there are other carvings too in Ballynacurriga.
Yes.
Very unusual. Very unusual.
Yes, absolutely. So you said Colin, what's his last name? Sorry.
Colm Horahan.
Okay. Thank you very much. Great presentation. Fascinating subject, as you can see.
I am very.
Thank you so much.
May I ask a very brief question, maybe? I know time is running low. Is that permissible?
Yeah, very, very fast.
Very fast. I'm wondering, are there any more castles remaining to be discovered in Ireland? Because so many of them in latter years, I believe, were incorporated into Georgian houses. And very often you have to wait, sadly, for a house to burn down or something before the castle is revealed. I mean, take Powerscourt in Wicklow, for example. But there are many, many other examples of houses destroyed during the Troubles. I know of a number that incorporate medieval tower houses into them. And in fact, as recently as a couple of years ago, there was a house for sale in Sallins in County Kildare that had the remains of Sallins Castle built within it, and you could still see the vaulted ceiling. So I'm just wondering what other great secrets might be revealed as time goes on. End of question. Thank you.
No, I absolutely agree. We stayed in a wonderful house up in where was it? Roscommon, Mears Court, and it had a tower house. I mean, it was completely invisible. You couldn't possibly have seen it from the outside, but there were clues, if you look closely enough. And just was it just a couple of years ago? Was it Manor Hamilton, someplace like that? They found a plantation castle down a back lane that nobody had just sort of put it all together. That this was what this was.
Fascinating. I had no idea, but I know of a family that have a house that's currently undergoing restoration in Wexford, and at the back of it there appears to be a strong house, probably from about 1660, and that's another classification, another type of building, I suppose, that's merely 2 stories, maybe a great hall and a kitchen underneath with a fabulous fireplace now in ruins. But I wonder if many of those also exist, and should they be classified as castles?
Yeah.
End of question. Thank you. A fabulous, a really fascinating presentation. Thank you very much, Finola.